Welcome to the Practice Podcast, conversations probing the nature of practice. I'm your host, Dave Fearon. This is episode 15. It's also the last week of 2019. And so Peter and I look back on what we've done so far on your behalf, and also because we enjoy thinking about, talking about practice. I hope you've enjoyed listening and will join us in future episodes in 2020. So that's what you'll be hearing today. A bit of looking back and a little bit of looking forward, but a lot more insight into the big P, which is practice. Well, Peter, this is our 15th episode. And for those, isn't that something? We're doing them once a week. I'm revealing that now to our listeners. And we started this late last June. We barely missed a week. And over the period of weeks, we started with the intention to open up each of the conjectures that we have in a working manuscript called Notes on Practices initially, and now Practice as a Way of Being, or Practice with a big question mark. And once we got into it and talked about those conjectures, then other ideas seemed to come to us. And over time, I think we've actually developed further than where we were when that manuscript was written. So I thought what we could do, since it is the end of this year and we'll be starting a new year with continuing podcasts, that we could do some thinking back, some reflections on our reflections about this experience we're having in exploring the nature of practice. So I thought what we could do, well, let me start with a personal question. What's it felt like for you to be doing this week after week?
I think the main thing the main meaning it has had for me. My voice is pretty gravelly today. The main meaning it's had for me is kind of a review of many of the issues that I have worked through in my teaching career, but also my career working with practitioners in consulting and training in the world of work. And I've had the privilege of quite a wide spectrum of exposures to corporations, public agencies, a lot with health systems, some offbeat ones like the East Coast Scrap Iron Collection Consortium or something. In other words, junk men.
I was going to say.
They professionalize themselves with something more grand than junk men, but that's
much better.
Basically what they are. But they're very dedicated human beings, small businessmen, and a couple of others. Another one that always tickled me was that there's a very large practice of collecting wooden pallets. There's so much shipping going on from manufacturers to whatever their distribution points are. And that means that the wooden pallets pile up and then they circulate back to the producers. There's a very large world market for pallets. And so these pallet manufacturers have got a professional society. And I was privileged to speak to them too. So anyway, an exposure that taught me a great deal about what's on the minds of men and women who are just trying to get some work done. And they themselves are quite curious about what we all do with subjects like leadership and group behavior and teamwork and motivation and all that sort of thing. Many of them are amazingly knowledgeable about those subjects. Many of them have picked up advanced degrees along the way. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because I really can't tell you how many times coming back to the campus from having been away on some trip to talk to some group of practitioners on, as I said, any of a wide variety of subjects, virtually all of the federal departments, for example. I have been able to journal extensive learning experiences. In fact, I built up a whole academic practice on the subject of strategic planning and strategic management as a result of talking to some men and women who are doing strategy uh, for real in their organizations.
Right. That's
and I'd never had occasion to study that particular subject before I encountered it in my own practice. But I rather quickly I perceived that strategy is organizational behavior, and as such, there's nothing mysterious or esoteric about it. It's organizational behavior, and so I undertook to understand it in those terms, and I rather quickly began to make contributions to my academic colleagues on the subject of what strategic management is, because they were focused entirely on the technical content and not on the behavior. I had a manager at a senior manager at very large, in fact, dominant in its industry, manufacturer of contact lenses in California, say that in fact the principal problem with strategy was making it real and meaningful to his colleague managers in the company, and explaining it and keeping it alive and vibrant. And it was actually out of a few contexts like that that I developed the idea of purposing. And I discovered that one of the key things about a high performing system is the ability to stay on message, so to speak, to stay focused on what are we here for, what's our reason for being, all those fundamental questions. And those are the ones that high performing systems have kept alive. So that kind of a bridge for me between practice and the academic world, call it theory if you want to, has characterized the last 40 plus years of my career. And I've often said to myself many times, I don't know if I could sustain a practice of pure academic life without almost weekly exposure to the world of work as it is, and be able to cycle back and forth between the two contexts. I don't know if that has been your experience or not.
Well, it is, and I've heard a couple of themes run through here that are familiar from our collaboration on the other podcasts, and one of them that we looked at last time was how we bring people who have ideas about how things work to the academic world to be listened to and be appreciated, so that some of their thoughts can be turned into eventually what we call theory. And that was actually one of our conjectures, was that practice can precede theory. So
often precedes theory.
Often precedes theory. And essentially what you said now is you've been living that. And, when you wanted to learn more about strategy, why not talk to people who do it and really get into it, and then bring it back and put it into tie it up with a bow. So that was really great. And what you're asking me, what initially brought me to this subject, and I said, well, to myself, I can't even imagine how I could have made myself into a teacher if I didn't know the learner. I had to know the learner, not the learning or the subject or the student or the people on the roster. My teaching wires stay dormant until they're lit up by this kind of thing we're doing right now.
Yeah.
Much more interactive, conversational. Who am I with here? If it's 30 people, 300 or one, that seems to matter a lot. And now I can put better words to it. It's not just because they're fellow humans, which is wonderful, but they're doing things. And I've always been fascinated with people who can do things, particularly things that I can't do, and I'd love to. So that doing is really the hook that's got me right here, in the mouth. And I don't want to get off it. And the good news is, even though I'm no longer in the classroom all that much, and you aren't either, every time we look around, we're seeing people doing things that we're curious about. You, on the one hand, are wondering what people who do things with iron and or pallets do, and you probably wanted a little more explanation. And I just finished my third morning at a fitness center learning from young man who has become a personal trainer. And first thing he said when he met me a few days ago was, "Yeah, I was in construction for 30 years, and now I do this." And my head immediately went, "Construction, physical. Where's the connection?" Now that I get to know them a little bit better, I will find out if he sees any antecedents in his current work with helping me build my strength, reconstruct, remodel my 76-year-old body, and what kept him in construction all those years. My hunch is he likes to see things come together and work. That putting it all together and then tightening the bolts and it's done. So we'll see. So that's sort of where I am on it now.
By the way, my personal opinion, and I've actually shared this with numerous people, my personal opinion is that it's very hard to maintain a fitness program of any kind
Yeah.
if it's not a practice for you. In other words, if it's just something you occasionally do when you have a free couple of hours, and not anything you really think about, you don't read any books about it, you don't subscribe to any magazines about it, and so forth, it's very hard to sustain it. And I was a jogger for something over 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
I ran almost 200 10-kilometer races, 10 marathons. I was pretty serious about it. And I have, over the years, met many people who want to become runners to lose weight or uh, whatever. And I've told people don't get into an aerobic training program unless you really enjoy the activity. If you're just doing it for health reasons and you're kind of undergoing the suffering that entails. And I'll say this to you: find the exercises that you really like and really look forward to performing, and those are the ones that will sustain your practice. A good friend of mine who was actually a dean of the School of Dentistry found as his aerobic activity that he could sustain jumping rope. and he was jumping rope for an hour and a half every day. And he told me, I can't get into running, I can't get into swimming, I can't get into bicycling, but skipping rope just does it for me. And so he experienced all of the benefits in the form of blood pressure and pulse rate and body weight and so forth, all of the benefits that aerobic activity brings you through skipping rope.
I bet you could do the fancy stuff, where you.
Well, I wouldn't be surprised by what you learn to do some of those things.
Well, you're right on about the entering into a state of practice. All the years that I've tried to maintain certain amount of fitness, it was mainly through game, like racquetball and things that I enjoyed. Uh, I would walk through the area where people were using machines or stretching or working with weights, and I'd say, "Oh, I can't do that. That's too boring. I need a game." Well, this is my challenge now to see, to your point, if I can find the pleasure, something I will look forward to, that in conscious intention to achieve results that go beyond my 10 free lessons, which is what I have now. But it's emerging. And here's another insight I've gained. It's not only the finding the activity that, will sustain my interest, but the place seems to matter. Uh,
Yeah.
who's with me and what are the bells and whistles and so forth. And in this place, and I've been in several clubs. I have former students who actually run three of the clubs in this particular chain. So I'm aware of all the things that they try to put together to make it appealing. But I have the direct experience now of coming into this place that they've just turned over from a former where it used to be a tennis club, and now they're putting in some money and fixing it up. And I even like the feel of that. I like the fact that there's an intention there to remodel section after section of this rather large facility. And each time they remodel it seems to light people up. The other first time I arrived, it wasn't someone who was out there trying to sell me a membership. It was someone who was a member who said, "Oh, you're new here. Let me show you what we've done." And that member said, "We." The club's only been open about 8 months. So let me show you what we've done. So
Yeah.
there's the culture aspect of practice, that context that we've talked about in our way of thinking about practice.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you want to be with people in an environment where the culture reinforces the the intentionality, but the fun. Now I'm back to golf
Yeah.
because there's dozens of golf courses, and the one I'm happy about is the one where it's beautiful in a sense, but it fits my taste for just enough. If it's too fancy, it's not me. If it's not well maintained, it's not me. So you find a niche. There's something about that in the way people get set into a continuous state of practice, Peter, where they kind of have to put all those little dots together and connect them into a holistic feeling.
Well, and we have said that practice is a system. It's not just one activity, and that the one of the things that distinguishes a practice from a non-practice, I guess you would say, is that is for an experienced practitioner, all the bits and pieces lying around in their practice, which may not make much sense to a layperson, or even if a layperson knows what the various things do, uh, he or she may not have them woven together in a stream of effective behavior.
Hmm.
And that's one of the key things about practice in general, is that the bits and pieces have come together in behavior and in awareness. So that, and in particular, this last point you make about culture, that the context of the practice is very important. And one of the key elements of context is to, I guess, be with other practitioners,
Hmm.
read about other practitioners. If it's a certain kind of practice, you might produce ideas yourself that you can share with your colleagues. And Dave, we get to talking this way, and I just have to say, continually, you ask, how has all this, what has all this meant for me as we've gone through it? I just can't get over how just plain sad it is that so many practitioners are going through their lives of practice without being understood and valued. And occasionally somebody will make a ringing speech on behalf of small business or something, but
Mm.
and to make it really personal for myself, I've had so many working adults in class over the years who were serious practitioners, and who I, in retrospect, don't feel I honored as much as they deserved in my teaching. And I've actually thought of several things I could have done with working adults to honor their practices. Feel I did, and it used to intrigue me that I had so many students who were working adults.
Mm-hmm.
I think my whole career I taught at least one course every semester in the evening. UCLA Extension was where I started, which was a very highly developed continuing education system in California. And practically the whole day curriculum that younger people would be taking full time was available to individuals, at least in the business programs, was available to individuals at night if they wanted to. Took them a little longer, but that they were certainly willing to endure that. And I actually wrote a long essay about the part-time teacher and the life that he or she leads, and how higher education treats the part-time or the adjunct teacher, which isn't very well, in my opinion.
No.
And I came to that out of an awareness of how many adjunct professors we were accumulating at George Washington University, and that they basically had no voice in the academic programs. They didn't have offices. They didn't have, in some cases, they didn't even have a place to sit down when they came on campus. And it used to trouble me a lot. And I used to make speeches to the faculty about it. But it was true also of the part-time students. The four-year full-time model dominates higher education, and yet fewer and fewer students are going through 4 years full-time at the undergraduate level.
That's right.
And at the graduate level. In fact, at George Washington, there were periods when the majority of our full-time graduate students were international students who were being teaching, whose studies were being paid for by their companies.
Yep.
And the company wanted them to go through full-time, so they did. That's not a situation that the system recognized.
Still doesn't. It hasn't changed. In fact, if anything, it's gotten worse because of the economics of higher education. But there's something that pops into my mind that goes with what you just said about those adjunct teachers, because I used to get to know them as best I could, and for two reasons. One, they were practitioners doing something out there, and I wanted to know what was going on. There it is. The other thing is, they were in touch with those students that we didn't see if we were teaching only at today. They were in touch with those working kids, and we were a business school. Some of those people were coming in. They've already shouldered some tremendous responsibilities, and if it's a small business, they've got the whole thing on their shoulder. If it's a big corporation like the ones around us, they were getting some pretty heavy duty assignments to achieve. And boy, the lessons that we could be picking up, those adjuncts were the ones who got to learn those things with them, and we barely ever downloaded that intelligence that was gained from the adjuncts and the part-time students into our discussions about curriculum, about program.
The reason we didn't do it, we as a kind of collective faculty and a collective full-time system, the reason we didn't do it is because we didn't have an effective way of thinking about practice.
Well, the way we thought about it was not cast in a leading role. Talk about casting our podcasting. Practice was not cast in a leading role. Theory was cast in a leading role. So practice at best was one of those awards they give for support, and for the best supporting actress. And I know this because we didn't have many discussions about it. We were looking at changing a course or designing a new course. I know that I and Steve Cavallari and a few of us who wrote some really interesting courses, managing and organizing for quality, organizing for innovation, managing, organizing for knowledge. Those were courses that we designed fully with the intention that they were going to mean something to people in practice. But the whole lot of other courses that were there, we barely touched. The dust grew and grew on those courses. I took an introduction to management, which can be now basically taught by a robot if the way they've made it so automatic. And I blew it apart and said, my job is to prepare people who are going to have to think managerially no matter what they do. Whether
Yeah.
no matter what they do, they have to think managerially and they have to understand leadership. So that's how those courses, and it was always about becoming. One day you're going to become an intrepid time traveler was the last model that I used, or becoming I had one for the innovation course, no, the quality course called becoming an impresario. And they had to figure out what the impresario was because I said, if you're going to manage quality, you don't manage it simply with looking, counting up how many widgets went into the reject bin. An impresario has to look at the reject bin, but then he has to have this, or she has to have this very encompassing feeling for the essence of the whole production, staging, lighting, tickets, sweeping up after the crowd, picking the actors and kicking them out if they're not good. Impresario is putting on a show. And my point to them was, if you can take that spirit out there into the workplace with that feeling that you're looking at how the show's going, and now you're looking at audience, now you're looking at customer experience. Imagine a show that's a flop. Why is it a flop? Because people didn't enjoy it and they're not telling their friends and they're not buying tickets. There's business for you. Now I'm yakking, taking up all of our time here, but I think that what we've arrived at in this conversation is that both of us honor practitioners more than in words or in gestures, vacuumed up a lot of their experiences and turned them into something that will be useful for others as they come along. And maybe that's what we're doing with this podcast.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. Once again, it takes a certain perceptual ability to see that impresario as more than just a wheeler dealer and a knockoff of the Zero Mostel role.
I was going to say I did show them a few clips from the producers to get them into the spirit of things. But then I said, but don't do that because they get arrested and thrown in prison.
That awareness that led me to the image of the managing as a performing art. It was the title of one of the books that I was able to produce. And some people misunderstood that title. They thought it meant managing as a superb manipulator.
Oh, really? No kidding.
In a negative ethical sense. And of course, I didn't mean it that way at all. I meant it in the sense that you're talking here about an impresario. I meant it as a image of someone who online in real time has to just bring together and hold together and develop together a whole series of different elements, some of which are human beings and many of which are technologies and other aspects of the physical environment, as well as the economic environment. Most managers are pretty conscious of their budgets, and that is an element that takes a lot of skill to do the things you want to do within the budget that you have to do them. And there are a lot of managers, I'm sure, that have things they would like to do with their practice and in their systems, who just can't because they don't have the budget for it.
That's right.
And I've heard managers say things like, "I've been putting that in my budget for years, and it gets X'd out every time."
Every time, yeah.
And maybe it's some expenditure that it seems to be rather important to the practice, but the higher ups who sign off on it, or the finance manager, or whoever, just don't see it that way.
Yeah.
I had that experience many times as a dean, trying to get more line items or more space or a new building for that matter. The higher you go up in the organization, the more they just look at the financials and not at the substance of what you're doing. And
Right.
many practitioners are painfully aware of that the higher ups just don't understand the substance. All they understand are the financials. And so that's an element of the practice,
Yeah.
is to make it more meaningful to the higher ups.
Yeah.
And to let them in on the game and the fun. And I've met practitioners who are very good at that, taking the boss on plant tours and things like that,
Mm-hmm.
and helping he or she to understand what they're spending all this money on. But then I've met other practitioners who are indifferent to it or unaware of it, almost hostile about it, in the sense that my vice president doesn't know or care what I do around here. He just wants to know how much money I want or something.
What's entailed as well for the managerial leader or anyone else for that matter is how well they're able to tell the story, to put into talking about performance in theater. What is the plot? What is it? Uh, what is going on because of us that we're proud of, that we can tout, that we can include in our brand? And I think that an aspect of persuasion is to have a really good story to tell. That artistic quality is something that I really wanted my students to pick up on. I had a lot of a lot of our exercises that we've designed in the art behavior world have a lot of improvisational moments, don't they, Peter? You know,
Absolutely.
we're trying to get them to be able to put together something quick and moving. And I will then go back to IA 338, a poem that I wrote once for Peter Vale. You know, I love you, IA 338. I still remember that. It's been over 50 years. But all one of the things we've said, I love you, A38. Industrial administration. What a horrible title for those courses.
I know.
But I think that what we've said about every sort of practitioner under the big P with the underscore is that once they've they've made the intention real to themselves that they're going to become a practitioner, they pull everything in, everything, all those dots we talked about connecting, they're integrating constantly into being able to tell their tale, to at any moment say, this is what I experienced today, this is what I like to see us doing. I found that while you told me once that when you started writing those books or your essays and other things, you just start laying down, you have an idea what you want to write about, but then you start laying down the sentences, and as they come to you, other things come to you, and it becomes more organic in terms of how it grows into a lesson, chapter, section, or a
Yeah.
conjecture about practice. Could you tell us a little bit about the experience you're having in going from that ability to write your thoughts out and see them emerge, and now all these 15 sessions talking? Do you write like you talk? Do you talk like you write? Or is this
Well,
altogether different for you?
you and I have chuckled together over the Maine accent. You are a practitioner of the Maine accent. Yeah, you grew up with it, and it is thick. It is thick in your conversation.
Yeah.
I'm a lover of the Maine accent, and I was once introduced in Portland to a room full of Portland businessmen. At that time, I was dean at George Washington, and I was up in Maine with NTL in Bethel.
Mm-hmm.
And I won't stop to talk about NTL and Bethel, but that's another whole story. But anyway, that's why I was in the state, and they had NTL had set me up with this group of Portland businessmen. Anyway, comes the luncheon speech. I'm sitting there, and the chairman of the group gets up and talks about me, and he says, "I will now attempt to approximate a Mann accent. Our speaker today is a young fellow by the name of Peter Vale from Washington, D.C., where he earns his living by talking." Where he earns his living by talking, which is true. But that way of putting it was a surprise to me, and I remembered it happened practically not as long ago as your poem in ID 338, but practically that long ago.
Right. That's right.
And it's vivid in my memory as a way of capturing my practice, earning your living by talking.
Mm-hmm. So this format that we've been using has come somewhat easily for you then.
No, I have never.
Since you're a talker.
That's right. I was a talker before I was anything else. I've always been quite a verbal person.
Mm-hmm.
I'm fond of saying that it's not as if I became a professor when I was 25 years old. I became a professor when I was 5 years old. I didn't know I was, but I've been explaining things to people all my life.
And that's a big reveal right there.
Yeah, I perceive that in myself, that I like to explain things to people, and so I've always been pretty verbal and have a reasonable vocabulary. So it's not been a big transition, but it's not something that I've trained for.
Did you find it when you then had to turn yourself into a writer in order to be perceived as a scholar, that you had to struggle a bit with the sort of rules of writing that were so strict back then and still are in a sense,
Well, I didn't know this was
being
going
the third person and, you must.
I didn't know this was going to become a confessional, David, but
it's time now, right before the end of the year to get it off your chest.
But writing has always come very naturally to me also, and I've never made any real attempt to sound scholarly.
Well, I can edit that out.
I don't know whether I sound very scholarly or not, but I've never made any attempt to sound scholarly.
You do.
So it just kind of happens to be a couple of abilities that have stood me in good stead in a wide variety of contexts. So he earns his living by talking.
Yeah, and I would say that your notion of liking to explain things. Now here we are with quite a compendium of ideas about this word practice. We've now explained practice dozens and dozens of ways, and we've both agreed that there's no particular end to the ideas that we can have as we keep an eye on a practitioner and or the whole big subject of practice. It's friggin' fascinating. And so, but it's still from, I think, the standpoint of most people, that second tier, third tier consideration for those of us who do claim to be scholars and actually have been called scholars. So what I think the word to the scholar is, our fellow scholars, is tone it down and ease up and listen to the language of people who do. And if you can get some of that tone and rhythm and a few more stories into your writing, it might actually make it to the main stage. It might be on the big screen. And so there's my confession that I never was that confident as a writer, but once I started writing, I knew that I had to get those words done in order to get through to people in a different way. So coming toward the end of our recording time here, and we've started this with the expectation that we'd reveal, that's the word, what it's meant to us to be collaborating so far on these podcasts. So why don't we have a sort of a closing thought on that, and then maybe segue into what we look forward to coming up once we start the year 2020. What's it meant?
Well, my closing thought is actually to remind you and our listeners. It's reminding you, and it's informing our listeners because they didn't hear it earlier in our collaboration last, I guess, about 6-7 months ago. We submitted our ideas in the form of a manuscript to a publisher, and one of his elements of feedback to us, it was encouraging feedback, but he said, you have to be clear on what's your big idea, what's your big idea that people will remember and identify you with. And I really think part of our problem with that publisher, and maybe with other individuals also, is they don't really see our big idea for what it really is. And we've been trying to make that more vivid in all of these podcasts. Our big idea is that there's this capital P practice, that there is this phenomenon of practice which stands by itself as a category of knowledge. And we've been trying to say what some of the characteristics of that category are, and how it plays in the minds and mouths of practitioners when they get to talking about their practice. But for me, that is our big idea. If it's not big enough, then so be it. It's a big idea for me in the sense of, have I been thinking in those terms as deeply and thoroughly in my 50-year career as they warrant? And the answer is sometimes I have and sometimes I haven't. But maybe for us to be putting this capital P practice idea out there as a phenomenon in its own right will be of interest to some others also.
Oh, I agree. I think I have talked it up as I have moved through my time, and you have too. Some of the caregivers have come to your place. You've talked to your physicians. You've talked to your family, and what is exciting about it, and I go back to that publisher and say, hey, it doesn't take me more than a few sentences before if I put it in terms of what you are, how you come across to me, this is what I think practice, like, oh yeah. And they want to talk about it. And see, there's tens of thousands, millions maybe of people who have the intention to elevate their work and develop themselves through their work in a very somewhat well-known and sometimes very modern and novel ways, but there's thousands of them out there. And
I had a conversation just
go ahead.
Just last week at a Christmas party with a librarian of all things.
There you go.
And his reaction was, "Oh, really? Oh, really?" When I told him that he had a practice and asked him what his practice was, he goes, "Oh, really? You're interested?"
Yes. Yes. So, did he tell you a little bit about it?
Oh yeah, and particularly how the digital revolution is impacting the life of the librarian.
There you go. Well, I have two librarians joining us for a week. My son and his wife, both librarians for Johns Hopkins, and they never dreamed that they would become librarians, but they are. And now I think they're right in the thick of it with all the changes that are going on in that realm. Dave is on the data side, and Linda's on the archive side, and they're like living between the two eras, which is exciting. And I'm going to listen a lot to find out what they're getting from their practice. I do think it is something, Peter, that is a phenomenon. I thought about all the years that we have focused on organizations of people, as if an organization is it. as if the organization should be the primary
Yeah.
subject matter for let's say a business school. It's the organization, and which is two or more people doing things together that neither of them could achieve alone, and all of those things. But there's so much attention to the collective that just by turning our eye to the individual who is the sole owner and keeper of a practice is very refreshing. But it also then can put together that person practicing within as a member of an organization context, but that person then removing the practice and carrying it on further developed to another organizational setting. That's a missing piece, I think, in the literature and the conversation. So this is going to be our contribution as we put this podcast further and further out, and hope that our listeners will send it along to their fellow practitioners and among them teachers, and get the buzz going. And then one day, maybe we can come back to that publisher and say, "Hey, we've got a big thing. It's practice." No, he's a great guy, and he was very kind to us. But it did spur us on to do this. And like, we'll show him. Oh, that was me. We'll show him. So this has been great. I look forward to what we'll be doing in the future. I think a couple of ideas have popped up and that we've talked about. When people see us resume this collaboration in 2020, in less than 2 weeks, I'd like to see us actually see if we can get a third person on screen and have a conversation, with you and me and that person being either a practicing academician, like some of the folks that we know, and or many of the folks that you and I have taught, you through Antioch when you were teaching at the doctoral level with people who were doing some exciting practices out in the world, and me with some of my more local former students, like I mentioned on the last one, Brian, the guy from 58 Stores Up.
Yeah.
And it might be fun to kind of weave some of those folks into future conversations. What do you think?
Oh, to me, that's a step that is essential.
Yeah.
To actually fly these notions past people who have an in-depth experience of practice and are not necessarily academicians with a lot of book learning on the subject. And I know several, and you know several. I actually know a lot of practitioners who are academics or who have become academics.
Yeah, that's true.
In fact, one of the deans who succeeded me at George Washington had been a practitioner of accounting his whole career and achieved a very senior role in his firm and in his profession. And it was quite an experience for him to enter a academic environment, particularly in a leadership role.
Yeah.
But he used to talk about how the environment, his environment as a senior executive in the accounting world and his environment as a senior executive in the academic world, what they had in common and how they differed. And I do remember one of his points about how they differed was, he said, in the business world, there is in the air, so to speak, a strong desire to get something done.
Yes.
and I don't experience that among a bunch of professors. That was one comment he used to make.
Those are the great moments, though, when you get that feeling of contrast. But I feel the winds are blowing in favor of academia becoming more practice-like, in the better sense of the word. That we're casting practice in a starring role here, and I'm proud to do it. I've been delighted to do it with you this year, Peter. I look forward to next year. I understand the challenges you faced, and I certainly appreciate how you're always up and ready to go on time. Now that you've mastered the technology, and I'm almost there mastering the podcasting practice. So I think we're going to have some fun in 2020.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Look forward to it. Meanwhile, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you.